The Oregon Ducks enter the 2024 season with a roster that is absolutely loaded. But how will that roster translate into the Big Ten Conference in their very first year in this league? Doug Scott of the QB11 Show joins me next to preview all things 2024 Oregon Ducks.
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
Since the Big Ten was 10, 8 teams have joined the conference since then. This team, the Oregon Ducks, might be the best since that first expansion candidate in 1993 with Penn State coming into the conference. To talk all things 2024 Oregon Ducks, we welcome in our buddy Doug Scott, co-host of the QB11 Show. We are going to keep things very simple to start things off, Doug. Is this the 2024 Oregon roster? Is this the best Oregon roster of all time going into a season?
Undoubtedly, yes. Not without a question.
Considering that with the roster and all of the talent and all of the expectations that might go along with that, how do you manage things on the other side when you're moving into a new conference? And that might kind of switch things up a little bit, because even if you're a really good team, like the Oregon Ducks are, kind of playing a different schedule, playing a different style of team, it's going to take some adjusting to. How do you kind of balance those two things together as an Oregon Duck fan right now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, since Dan Lanning became coach a couple years ago, he's entering his third season now. I mean, he came from the SEC. He's got that background. He's from the Midwest, obviously, as well. They're from Missouri. And he's been molding this team, in the image of an SEC program, of a Big Ten program, of a major conference. And I consider there to be 2 power conferences now, not 4. He's been building this team in that way, right? He's turned over the roster. I think there's only 6 players on this 2024 roster that he inherited. Everyone else has been brought in either through the high school recruiting or the transfer portal by Lanning and company since then. And so what you've noticed over the last couple of years, and you'll see particularly in this season, is the trenches, right? Just the size and mass and power and the physical stature of these players on the offensive and defensive lines don't look like a West Coast football program. It looks like a Big Ten program. It looks like an SEC program. And so they've been building for that already, because his goal has always been to win a national title here, right? So he hasn't been building a Pac-12 program. He's been building a national program. So, but obviously, as you said, you're coming into now one of the 2 Power 2 conferences. You have, I think, a much more physical brand of football on a week in, week out basis. There were certainly some physical football teams in the Pac-12, but you didn't see them every week. It was more here and there, scattered throughout the season. So I just think, Oregon has got to be, they got to play that game every week, right? They got to be ready to play that game, the rest and recovery, the physical nature. It's going to take its toll. And we talked about this a little bit off air. Oregon generally has a pretty favorable schedule this year. The one downside to it is they got an early bye in week 4 and a late bye in week 13. So in between, they play 8 straight Big Ten conference games. They start with UCLA all the way through Wisconsin. No breaks, and then they get their last bye before playing Washington in the last game of the season in that rivalry weekend. So that's going to be a challenge when you get through that 8-game slog, right? And even though the schedule is pretty favorable, you got a kind of a strong team followed by a less strong team, but still they're all games you got to play. There's no week off in that stretch. So certainly Oregon's got to step up to that challenge. The first year in the Big Ten, and new environments they haven't played in before. New coaches they haven't played against before, different styles of play in some cases. So a lot of teams run, more 12, 13 heavy package personnels, that Oregon's going to have to be more used to that. Not that they can't match up with that. They have the bodies to do it, but they haven't had to do it as much in the past. So just being that consistency week in and week out is going to be something they're going to have to adapt to.
When we talk about Oregon, I think we got to start first on the offensive side of the football. A Heisman finalist last year in Bo Nix, and this move at the quarterback position, peak Dan Lanning, right? You lose Bo Nix, and then you bring in a quarterback in Dillon Gabriel, top 10 in the country last year in a majority of passing statistical categories. Oh, and then you just have Dante Moore as your backup, right? The flip and the talent that now exists in this quarterback room is one of the best in all of college football. Talking about Dillon Gabriel, right? The guy that is going to be the guy at Oregon behind center this year. What about his skill set kind of blends into what Will Stein wants to do, kind of compared to maybe what Bo Nix was? A lot of people calling Dillon Gabriel maybe the left-handed Bo Nix.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. I think it's actually going to be pretty seamless. They're not exactly identical quarterbacks, but their strengths are very similar. They both are extremely accurate in the short and medium game, right? Bo Nix set an all-time completion percentage record last season. Dillon Gabriel completed passes at a similarly high rate, throws very accurately. And Oregon's, offense under Will Stein is really about getting players in space, getting them the ball, letting them do what they can do, right? And Oregon has a lot of playmakers both out of the backfield and out wide and at tight end position. So I think you're going to see a lot of similarities there, a lot of screen game, a lot of short passes, a lot of RPOs, get the ball out, get it to players, let them make a play with their feet once they get it. Doesn't mean they're not going to throw down the field. They're obviously going to take their shots. Dillon Gabriel is actually a pretty good deep ball thrower. He might be a better deep ball thrower than Bo Nix in a lot of ways, a little more accuracy. He doesn't have quite the distance, so he's got to get it out earlier to get there, or you can't quite get the ball all the way out to where it needs to go on the super deep route. But as long as he's getting it out early, he's pretty accurate on the deep routes as well. So Oregon will take their shots, but I think we're going to see a pretty similar offense to what we saw last year. Obviously, there'll be new additions, some wrinkles, and it sounds like Will's already incorporating some of the stuff that Gabriel did at Oklahoma, was comfortable with at Oklahoma as well. So there's always new wrinkles every year, but I think for the most part, it's a similar package of plays, and you'll see a similar result, I think.
You talk about getting your players in space. There's plenty of players at the wide receiver position. No doubt this might be the best wide receiver room in all of college football. You talk about bringing back Tez Johnson. He kind of leads the crew. He was behind Troy Franklin last year. It's kind of crazy that we can talk about this wide receiver room like we do, despite losing one of the best receivers in the country last year in Troy Franklin. You talk about Tez Johnson set a Oregon single-season reception record last year. How about Evan Stewart just coming over from Texas A&M, one of the highest-rated wide receivers in the country a couple of years ago in his recruiting class? Trayshawn Holden is in there, Gary Bryant, and others. What makes each one of these guys unique where they can be that breakout guy in an individual game?
Yeah, I really think, obviously, Tez Johnson was a great transfer Oregon picked up last year out of Troy, coming over to Oregon, which was his dream school as a kid. I'm sure you saw all the stuff on him and Bo Nix, and a lot of the halftime shows and whatnot. But it was funny because Troy Franklin set the single season receptions record last year at Oregon, along with yardage and touchdown. And then Tez Johnson broke the receptions record in the bowl game, which Troy set out. So they both set that record last year. But he's coming out of the slot, so he's a real dynamic, really small guy, but super quick and fast. So he, it really with him, it's what he does after the catch, what he can do, kind of shaking and baking people off the stem and just getting the ball in space, yards after catch. I think I saw he was top 5 in the country in yards after catch last year. So I think really that's kind of the key with him. Evan Stewart's really the guy you're bringing in to replace Troy at that X receiver position, right? Just get he's not the same player that Troy Franklin is. I think he does some things better, some things probably not as well. He's not as long, not as lanky. Maybe, but he's his contested catch skills aren't quite a bit better than Troy's. He's just really dynamic. He's really, I think when he's locked in and playing at the level he can play at, like, his ball skills are really great in, contested catches. And again, also very quick. So what he can do after the catch, I think, is a little more dynamic than, not that Troy was lacking in that area, but I think he's a little more dynamic there as well. Then you flip over to Trayshawn Holden, the Alabama transfer. Again, this is his second year at Oregon. He had a steady season last year, didn't put up monstrous stats, but, he was kind of the third receiver. He's the leader of the room. He's kind of an elder statesman in the room. I think he kind of peaked as the year went on. So I think he's kind of ready to come in this year 2 in the program and kind of be that leader on the field, but probably also produce a little bit more. So he'll be kind of the other. I think those 3 are the starters. And then with Gary Bryant Jr., last year when we brought him over last year from USC, QB and I both thought that the Ducks were going to move him back to the slot position, where I think he's best suited. I think it's where he does his best play. But because of the way the roster was stacked last year, they really ended up playing him mostly out wide, kind of backing up Holden or Troy Franklin last year. And he just didn't really produce a lot out there. It's probably the lowest snap count of the 4 receivers that played in the rotation last year. Had a couple of highlight plays here and there, just didn't get a lot of touches. But this year, I think they're moving him back into slot, so he'll be alternating in the slot position with Tez. And I think that's really a place where he's much more suited to make plays. So I'll be interested to see if his production steps up a little bit this year, playing out of the slot. And then beyond that, you've got five-star out of the class of 2023, Jurion Dickey. He entered Oregon last year injured out of high school, so he mostly was rehabbing. Didn't really get much of a chance to play last year, but he's healthy now. Looked pretty good in the spring, turned a lot of heads. So he's a guy that might push for playing time. And then beyond that, you got a couple of true freshmen in Jeremiah McClellan, who Oregon flipped late in the class from Ohio State, who's done some nice things in the spring as well. And then Ryan Pelham is another one they flipped from USC late in the cycle last year. I don't expect those two necessarily to play a ton of snaps, but you want to get them on the field, get them some reps, kind of get them into the offense, see what they can do as well. So it's a very deep room and certainly very talented.
Switching over to the run game, they lose a first-team all Pac-12 running back, a name that Big Ten fans might know, former Minnesota running back Bucky Irving moves on. But once again, we're talking about reloading here with the Oregon Ducks. You look at Jordan James, you look at Noah Whittington coming off of an injury. I really like Jay Harris, right? The Division II transfer looked really good in the spring game. There's a lot of depth within this running back room. We always talk about that pair and that spare in a running back room. Got to have that depth when you run the football in the Big Ten. A lot of attention is going to be on the pass game. Do you think that this run game could maybe even surprise some people how good and explosive that they could be this season?
I don't know if surprise is the right word. I mean, Oregon had a pretty strong running game, obviously, the last couple of years, led by Bucky Irving, as you mentioned. So I don't know if it would be a surprise necessarily. I think Jordan James, though, is someone who's going to be a breakout player this year. I mean, he averaged 7.5 yards a carry last year. I think ran for 700 yards. It's not like he was he didn't get a lot of usage, but now he's the number one, and I think he's gonna have a real breakout season. I'd say 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 yard back. New running backs coach this year, Rashad Samples, coming over from Arizona State, replacing Carlos Laughlin, who went over to Ohio State this year. So Laughlin really liked to run a 1A, 1B kind of rotation with his running backs. So the last couple of years, Bucky Irving even would probably get maybe 60% of the carries in a game, 60% of the reps. And then, he had Noah Whittington as kind of the 1B that first year, and then even last year until he got hurt, then it became Jordan James. So I'll be interested to see if Samples kind of does that kind of 60-40 split, or if it maybe trends more toward 70-30. But I don't know. Then you got, like you said, you got Jay Harris coming in as well, and he's kind of a much bigger, stronger back, pounded back. It'll be interesting to see how Oregon uses them. I know 2 years ago they used freshman Jordan James as kind of a goal line only back. Is that a role that maybe they carve out for Jay Harris this year, or is he just in the regular rotation? But I think he's a guy that he'll get his moments. I don't think he'll be, he's not going to be a 15 carry a game kind of guy, but he's a guy that I think can make some moves as well. So like you said, in running back's a position you always need depth at because the injuries happen. Guys get banged up. It's a brutal position. Take a lot of pounding.
I'm excited to see how kind of Will Stein operates this offense when we talk about that great pass game, and then we talk about this run game as well. It's going to be pick your poison maybe for the Oregon Ducks this season when it comes to run and pass. Now let's kind of get back to that pass game. This tight end room, it's one of my favorite tight end rooms for a couple of different reasons. First of all, you got two studs right off the bat. Of course, Terrence Ferguson might be one of the best tight ends in the Big Ten, maybe all of college football as well. Patrick Herbert provides some depth in that room, but this is where things really get spicy. Kenyon Sadiq, man, he's one of my favorite players because the Big Ten and tight ends, right? That is, especially at places, like the Iowas of the world, right? We know they've had good tight ends in this conference before. I'm not sure if we've seen a tight end like Kenyon Sadiq where you're running him on jet sweeps and getting him involved in the run game and all these other different packages and things that you can do with a player like that at the tight end position. What excites you most about what Will Stein is going to do with this group of tight ends?
Yeah, obviously Terrence Ferguson's kind of your starter and your primary guy there. Oregon, I'd say, they have so many playmakers, right? So it's, and they obviously fed the ball quite a lot last year to Troy and Tez. So they soaked up most of the receptions. I think the tight end position was probably a little underutilized in the passing game last year, but I don't think that's for a lack of ability or talent. I just think, there was more more targets going to those other guys. So we'll see this year if it's a little more balanced out with the tight ends, because Ferguson is a real weapon in the passing game for sure. And then Herbert's more of kind of the inline blocker, H-back guy, but certainly capable pass catcher as well. But he'll probably more sparingly in that space. But I think Sadiq, as you mentioned, is the one that everyone's excited to see. Played pretty sparingly last year. I think he had a couple touchdowns. I think they were both rushing on tight end jet sweeps, which is just absurd. And then we saw Oregon in the spring game, they lined him up at running back a couple of times. And I think they had him lead block one time and carry the other time. I think they're just trying to get him the ball. He's a guy you want to get the ball 3-4 times a game, just because he's such a dynamic athlete in space. Super fast. I think he posted this on his own Twitter a couple days ago. He clocked like 22.5 miles an hour, which is, that's like wide receiver cornerback speed. So at a tight end position. Now he's not the biggest, strongest blocker in the world, right? But that's not the role he's being asked to play. I certainly think he's a capable blocker. He's a willing blocker. He just that's not his body type right now coming into year 2 in the program. But, certainly a guy I'm excited to see in the passing game for sure, or the running game.
When we start to list off some of these weapons and all of these weapons, I think the biggest advantage for Oregon is when they can line up so many of them in a single formation on one play and almost overwhelm the defense with what you got a tight end, receiver, and running back on a given play. It's going to be interesting to see how defenses really combat that. Let's move on to the offensive line. Jackson Powers Johnson in the middle at center. He moves on, but you return not 1, not 2, but 3 starters from this really good unit last year. Of course, on the exterior, guys like Josh Connerly, Johnny Cornelius, Marcus Harper in the middle at guard. Is this a unit that you think can once again be one of the best in college football?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it certainly should be. It was, I think one of the top 10 lines, top 5 lines in the country last year. I think there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to pick up where they left off there. You mentioned Cornelius and Connerly at the tackle positions. They, both 3 all-conference players in the Pac-12 last year. Inside, the center, Iapani Lelalio. I'm terrible with these Polynesian names. He goes by Poncho. So he was a true freshman last year, kind of an unheralded recruit. His brother was on the team. He graduated last year, also at offensive line. Sparingly used, his brother was, but he was a true freshman coming in last year, kind of an under-recruited kid. A lot of Oregon fans are like, why are we taking this guy? So he recorded a lot of snaps at guard and center, primarily at guard last year. He played all 3 interior positions. He's going to be the center this year. Honestly, I think he's going to pick right up where Jackson left off. Obviously, a little less experience, but he is strong. I actually think he might be a little stronger than Jackson. Not as experienced, maybe not as diverse. But we'll see. He'll be at the center position. And then you mentioned Marcus Harper at left guard. I think it'll be his 3rd year as a starter. So really, there's just the right guard position is really the only new incomer this year. They brought in Indiana transfer Matthew Bedford. Yep. I think it was a 4-year starter at Indiana, 3-year starter at Indiana. I think had an injury year. He started at 4 positions along the offensive line at Indiana. I think he's probably penciled in right now as the right guard for this offense, but you love that positional versatility that he brings as well, because I will say the one of 2 weaknesses on this team from a roster position is tackle depth. So the starters, Cornelius and Connerly, are great. If for whatever reason either one of those 2 guys has to miss some time, that's where the real question mark comes into play along this offensive line. There's plenty of depth in the interior. The tackle depth is the question mark. So if you have a guy like Bedford, you might be able to slide out if you need to. That might be one way you could handle a situation like that if it were to arise. Otherwise, you're playing somebody who really hasn't played before.
Now, when we talk about the transition to the Big Ten for the Oregon Ducks and why a lot of people, including myself, feel that Oregon is the most ready of the 4 teams coming in to compete at a high level in the Big Ten, it's because of what they have in the trenches. Just talking about the offensive line, let's move over to defense, and let's talk about the defensive line. You bring in Jamari Caldwell as a transfer coming over from Houston, and how about some Big Ten beef with Derek Harmon, the former Michigan State Spartan, which was a big get for Dan Lanning and this Oregon Ducks defense. And how important is it to be able to have that beef up front and specifically that depth at that position on the defensive line in the interior to compete in the trenches of the Big Ten?
Yeah, no, it's critically important in this conference. Obviously, there's a lot of teams that like to line up and run at you and smash mouth football, and you've got to be able to stop that. You've got to be able to defend that, slow that down. I think Oregon has recruited the defensive line extremely well over the last couple cycles. They have a lot of big bodies in there. They graduated 3 or 4 guys off of last year's team on the interior, right? So Brandon Doros, Popo Amave, Casey Rogers all graduated, left the team, all went to the NFL. So you definitely had to reload there. Now Oregon could have reloaded with those young guys they had. A lot of them got some playing time last year, back in kind of some backup minutes, but you would have been playing some inexperienced younger guys, relying on them, and your goal is to win a national title, win the Big Ten title this year, right? So not that they don't like those guys, but if you can go out and get 2 players like a Derek Harmon and a Jamari Caldwell who come in, who have that experience, have that proven experience, now you're improving your front line and you're making your second line better, because those guys that were going to be starters are now your second string, and now your second string guys are now your third string guys. And I tell you what, all 3 of those lines can play. They're all guys that can play and play at a high level. I think bringing in that experience, though, is such a difference maker in a team that's trying to make a deep run this year. Right. Harmon was an interesting one because he went in the portal originally in December, visited Oregon. I think we all thought, yeah, we're going to get this guy. And then he went back to Michigan State, and we're like, oh, no. And then obviously we landed Caldwell in that first portal window. And that guy's a freak. Have you seen his tape?
Yeah.
Like he looks like a bowling ball.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, this guy's a nose tackle. But then you watch him play. He doesn't line up at nose tackle. He's lined up at end. He's lined up outside. He's running a 7 technique. He's blitzing off the edge. And he's crazy fast and agile and twitchy for a guy his size. So it'd be interesting to see how Oregon uses him.
Well, it's going to be I love what you said about those defensive tackles, because not only do they bring that Big Ten beef, not only do they bring the size, but they bring that quickness and agility to be able to get past these in a pass rushing type of scenario as well. Speaking of pass rushing, let's head over to those edge guys, the guys that are going to be able to bring pressure and rack up those sacks and bring down some of these Big Ten quarterbacks as well. I think they got a good one. Maybe they've got one of the better groups in the Big Ten Conference this year. You look at Jordan Birch, of course, coming off the edge, who's maybe the best out of this entire defensive line if you include these edge rushers. Mateo Uiagalelei, they're expecting a big jump from him in his second year on campus. Tatum Tuioti, Blake Purchase, maybe some younger guys that provide that depth. When you look at this edge rusher room, so to speak, do you think that this could be one of the best groups in the Big Ten at that particular position?
I mean, it could be. I think there's obviously some projection there, right? Because you are talking about, true sophomores this year in Uiagalelei, Purchase, and Tuioti, right? So they all played a lot last year. They were all part of the primary rotation all season long, got a lot of experience. Now it's year 2, right? You need to see that year 2 jump. You need to see that all that off-season training, that weight training, that strength and conditioning, that speed work, all of that hand work, all those drills paid off, and really see that huge jump in year 2. They all had pretty good freshman seasons. They all had their moments, but this is where you want to see that next step for those guys. And you going back to Jordan Birch, he's more of a big defensive end, great run stopper, incredible run stopper at that position, sets an edge like nobody's business. Hasn't shown as much pass rush ability last year at Oregon. He had his moments, but that's an area of his game even, as he's trying to prepare for the NFL. You'd like to see an uptick in that side of things for him, but incredible on the run defense there. And then you've got a whole other line of guys. You've got 5-star 2024 kid Elijah Rushing out of Arizona. How's he even gonna get on the field? And this kid's an incredible talent, right? And you got other guys like Jackson Jones and Ashton Porter, also a second-year player. And Ashton Porter is looking incredible this summer. But again, it's just an embarrassment of riches. Somebody's going to win these battles. Somebody's going to lose these battles. Or you just have a ton of depth as you get into the season and attrition happens because it's football, right? So we'll see what happens. I think it definitely has the potential to be one of the best edge rushing groups in the Big Ten. But, we've got to see those guys take that step before I'm ready to anoint that yet.
Boy, and they got some good ones in this conference, right? When you're talking about what Ohio State has with JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, how about Michigan with Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart coming off the edge? How about Penn State, Abdul Carter moving to defensive end? Even Iowa, there's some really good defensive lines. If you're the 5th best D line in the Big Ten, you still might be a top 10 D line in all of America, right? That's how good and how deep this conference. So even if Oregon's number 5, I think they're going to be doing just fine at championship level front up front as well. Let's head to the secondary. Kind of needed a boost from last year, and then you considered what was lost, right? Leading tackler Evan Williams, Steve Stevens, and they flipped this thing around. Maybe not only did they replace these guys, they maybe improved and took a little bit of a talent bump as well. You get Jabbar Muhammad, of course, from the arch rival up north, one of the best corners in the country last year over at Washington. Cam Alexander is highly thought of, highly graded from services like Pro Football Focus. And then Kobe Savage, right, who has Power 4 starting experience over from Kansas State. Do you think that the secondary is the best position group of this defense? And how much do you think that they've improved since last year?
The best. I don't know if they're the best. I mean, they're certainly. Well, I wouldn't know if I'd say they're the deepest either. Well, I think it's a TBD on the first part of the question, but I do think they've improved from last year. I'm going to talk about the corners first, and then we'll talk about the safeties. At corner last year, Oregon's front line, I think their starters were really solid. But what we saw during the year is both Kyrie Jackson and Jaleel Florence both got banged up. They both got hurt on the same exact play in the first Washington game and missed. I think Florence missed the rest of that game, and Jackson, who had separated his shoulder, played with the separated shoulder the rest of the game, and so that impacted the outcome of not only that game, but then later, throughout when they played Washington again in the Pac-12 title game. Again, both of them missed the whole second half of that game, and that's where you saw Oregon struggle when they had to go to their second line, third line corners, right? So what did they do? They said, you know what, you can never have enough guys who can cover. So they're bringing Jaleel Florence back, they're bringing Dante Manning back, they're bringing Nico Reed back. Yep. They went out and got, like you said, Jabbar Muhammad from Washington, no less, and then they got Cam Alexander out of UTSA. So they went out and got a bunch of guys who can cover. Oh, and they got the top JUCO, number one JUCO corner in the country, Sione Lalia as well. So he's like really long, lanky corner. So they've got now a ton of guys who can cover out of corner. Again, like what is that pecking order? What is that starting second deep, two deep going to look like there? But I think they went and addressed that problem pretty well. Starting level, they're probably pretty equal to last year, but I think the depth is much better at that position. On the inside, the safety was really Oregon's weakest position last year, and you saw it at both those Washington games and even the Washington game the year before. All three of those games, Washington exploited the lack of speed at safety in coverage for Oregon. Evan Williams and his brother the year before, great box players, great tackling safeties, just don't have the speed. Steve Stevens, experienced player, knew where to be, was always in the right place, just didn't have the speed to cover Washington's receivers, deep. Tysheem Johnson they brought in last year from Ole Miss. He was playing nickel last year. Again, just didn't have the speed in those long crossing routes, and he got picked on in those Washington games as well. They've moved him to deep safety this year. They're bringing in from Duke. They're bringing in Brandon Johnson, who's projected to be the starting nickel this year, and then so they're moving Tysheem to one safety, and then as you mentioned, Kobe Savage coming in from Kansas State at the other safety position. So, and then they've got some younger guys coming up, Tyler Turner, but the one I want to mention, true freshman Aaron Flowers, out of Texas. So one of the Oregon's biggest gets in this 2024 recruiting class. Looked incredible all spring. Looked great in the spring game. He's going to be pushing for starting minutes, certainly, but he's definitely going to be in the rotation. Probably the true freshman on this roster who will play right from day one, and I think play at a really high level. This kid's got an NFL future, and I think Oregon's really excited about having him in the rotation as well. So I think the secondary is certainly the most improved position group of any on this roster this year.
I'm curious what you think of this linebacking group in the middle of the defense, because I think I feel pretty good about up front, right, on the defensive line that we mentioned. Secondary, as you just mentioned, is pretty darn deep this year. But you look at this linebacker group in the middle. Jeffrey Bassa comes back second on the team in tackles. And finally, we get a healthy Justin Jacobs transfer from Iowa a few years back. How do you kind of handicap and how do you kind of evaluate what this linebacker group is going to look like for Oregon this year?
Yeah, I think those are your two starters, right? And Bassa will be his third year as a starter, I think. He's a converted safety, third or fourth year starters, ton of experience there. He's the kind of the quarterback of the defense, knows it inside and out. Justin Jacobs, as you said, battled injury a lot last year coming over from Iowa. So, seeing him fully healthy, I think as the year went on, he really got better and better toward the back half of that season. So I think you feel really good about those two. That said, I don't think either one of them is the prototypical linebacker style that Dan Lanning is looking for to run this defense. They're both really good players. But I think this is the position where Lanning is still trying to get his guys that are really going to be the best of this position in years going forward at Oregon. And he got 3 in this last class, 3 really highly rated linebackers. I don't expect them to necessarily play a lot this year, but these are guys that I think you're going to see in 2025, 2026 that become kind of the heart of this defense: Dylan Williams, Kamar McDuty, and Braden Platt. So those 3 will certainly be competing, maybe for some backup minutes, maybe for third-string minutes. Behind Bassa and Jacobs, you're really talking about guys like Devin Jackson, 3rd year in the program, Jerry Mixon, his 2nd year in the program. And then you've got the walk-on 2-sport athlete, Bryce Betcher, who's a walk-on in football and baseball. He actually just won the Gold Glove in baseball, led the team in hitting. Incredible athlete. He played quite a bit last year at linebacker as well. So him, Mixon, Connor Soleil back in year 2, and Devin Jackson will kind of all be in the mix there as well. So it'll be that's an interesting position battle. I'm looking forward to see play out in the fall. Kind of who, out of all of that group of the true freshmen and the 2nd and 3rd year guys, who kind of snatches up those second string spots there behind Boston. I do like the depth in this room. I think we're still a year or 2 away from peak linebacker play at Oregon.
When Oregon joined the Big Ten along with Washington in August, a lot of people around those 2 fan bases, of course, we're focused on Oregon in this particular preview, were very excited to join the conference. And then the next part of the next big excitement was when the schedule really came out and started to formulate, right, what an Oregon Big Ten schedule will look like. And that's what we want to take a look at right now. It is very manageable before their game on October 12th against the Ohio State Buckeyes, which is going to be one of the biggest college football games of this season. What do you want to see from this Oregon team in that first half of the schedule before Ohio State comes trotting into Autzen Stadium?
Yeah, I think really you want to play clean, right? You want to keep your penalties low, keep healthy as much as you can. Really, in most of those games, you'd like to see, like Oregon was great at this last year. They put teams away early. I think they had 10 of their 14 games were over by the mid-3rd quarter, right? So you want to see more of that because that gives you the opportunity to bring in those 2nd string, 3rd string, 4th string guys, get them real meaningful reps, which may pay dividends later in the season or certainly in the following season. So I think that's what you're looking for. Does Dillon Gabriel have a command of the offense? Can we get Dillon Gabriel out of the game so we get Dante Moore some real reps so that he's ready to go if he's needed later in the season, right? Dillon Gabriel's not a big guy, and he's had some injuries in the past. So, you want to have Oregon has not had a backup quarterback that they can truly rely on to execute the offense at a high level since probably 2013. It's been that long. So this year you feel like, hey, we finally have a situation where we might have that guy. We hope to have that guy. And you have a guy in Dante Moore who started, half a dozen games last year at UCLA. So you want to get him real reps in games to get him ready in case he needs to play. So that's what I want to see.
I'm excited to see what the Ducks have to offer. You said this is the best roster, or at least it appears to be the best roster in Oregon history. What a great time to have that roster. Their first season entering the Big Ten, first season of a 12-team college football playoff. Doug Scott from the QB11 Show previewing all things Oregon. Doug, it's going to be a fun year in Eugene. We'll see you down the road.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks for watching Big Ten Ted, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.